Thanks, Cian Corla. Taoiseach, on Saturday, tens of thousands of people will fill the streets of Dublin celebrating Pride. We'll be celebrating marriage equality, the belated apology for criminalisation, the role that the LGBTQ+ community continues to play in driving progressive change, illustrated in the 91% who voted for repeal. But Pride will also be a protest for trans healthcare, for the immediate rollout of PrEP on the HSE, for action to ensure that all families can be recognised as such on their children's birth cert. And what I want to focus on is the thousands who will be carrying placards saying, "Teach, don't preach, don't block the sex ed bill." Because in most of our schools right now, LGBTQ+ people are erased. Their sexual health, their relationships simply do not feature. What is provided is heteronormative and gender-normative sex education, where only reproductive intercourse is mentioned, and where trans people and non-binary people simply don't exist. We have been inundated with school students contacting us about their inadequate sex education. Courtney told us that her education, quote, only focused on heterosexual relationships. They mentioned bisexuals once when they asked, did we think they were greedy? 87% of school students surveyed felt that LGBTQ+ relationships were not discussed sufficiently in their RSE. Why is that? It's because of an outdated curriculum, but fundamentally it's because of church control of our schools and the religious ethos of those schools taking precedence over the rights of students to have access to necessary information. That religious ethos provision, contained in the Education Act, will stand in the way of even the best curriculum in the world being actually delivered to school students. It's yet another illustration of why we need separation of church and state. The impact of this on young people, on their mental health, is obvious. Where they're erased, where they're othered, it contributes to an atmosphere where bullying is more likely, where young people feel pressured to hide their identity, and shockingly, according to one study, 1 in 3 young LGBT people have attempted to take their life. What we need is factual, progressive sex education, which is LGBTQ+ positive, which is not gender normative, and which centres consent. That's what the Citizens' Assembly called for, it's what the Oireachtas Committee on the 8th recommended, and it's what the Dáil voted for in April when it passed the Objective Sex Education Bill through second stage. Crucially, that bill would amend the Education Act to ensure that it would be delivered, regardless of the religious ethos of the school. But Taoiseach, despite that vote, we have a problem. Cian Corla has decided that the bill would require incidental expenses, and therefore, to proceed to committee stage, we need you to sign a money message. I presume you'll be there on Saturday, Taoiseach. The question is, will you be able to tell the crowd that you're allowing this bill to continue to committee stage so that we can have necessary LGBTQ+ positive sex education in our schools, or will you have to explain why you are undemocratically using a money message to block the bill and standing in the way of the change we need?
Taoiseach.
I can reassure the Deputy that far from standing in the way of change, once again the Government is making change happen. This is a very important matter. It's one that we broadly agree on, in fact. We agree on the importance of our children and young people receiving age-appropriate, up-to-date information relating to their sexual health. The question is, how do we best go about making that change happen? Is it through the National Curriculum Advisory Council, which we used for decades now to set curriculums for subjects, or is it through primary legislation? We don't have primary legislation saying what should be on the history curriculum. We don't have primary legislation saying what should be on the physics curriculum. We don't have primary legislation saying what should be on the maths curriculum. That's not the correct approach to a school curriculum, changing it by primary legislation. It's best done the way that we have been doing it successfully for decades through the National Curriculum Advisory Council. So we have asked, and this is already underway, for a major review of relationship and sexuality education. It was announced last April already by Minister Bruton. Because the curriculum in some aspects is 20 years old, we believe that now is the time to carry out a major reform. In relation to the content of the curriculum, Minister Bruton has specifically tasked the National Council on Curriculum Assessment, that's the NCCA, to specifically consider a few areas in conducting its evaluation. These include consent, something that is so important and so widely discussed now, what it means and its importance. Secondly, developments in contraception. Third, healthy, positive sexual expression and relationships. Fourth, the safe use of the internet for all sorts of reasons that we understand. Fifth, social media and its effects on relationships and self-esteem. And sixth, LGBTQ+ issues. So the NCCA has been asked to do that and to ensure that we have a modern curriculum and that we can make these reforms and implement them in schools. And I strongly believe that this is the right approach. This is the way we should make change happen, and we shouldn't start legislating for curriculums in our schools. That's a different approach and a rather sinister one that does not tend to happen in democratic countries.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Murphy.
Disappointing, Taoiseach. Disappointing and extremely disingenuous, because I think you know that the bill that was passed with your government's agreement, of course, doesn't prescribe a curriculum. It doesn't have any intention of doing so. It sets out some extremely broad headings. But in particular, what it does, and what the approach that you're outlining will not do, is that it amends sections 9D and 15(2)b of the Education Act to deal with the issue of religious ethos. Does the Taoiseach not accept that you can have the best curriculum in the world, but because of the characteristic spirit of the schools and the way that's protected by the Education Act, the schools are under no obligation to actually teach it? If you're a student and you go to a maths class, they don't not teach multiplication because it's against religion. Well, if you're a student and you're LGBTQ+, you should have your identity recognised when you go to school, regardless of the religious ethos. So, Taoiseach, please deal with this in reality. Answer whether you will sign a simple money message. I would ask you to, if you're serious about what you're saying, that you think this is a serious issue to deal with, accept that we do need primary legislation to deal with this issue of religious ethos, and I'd ask you to put your money message where your mouth is.
Thank you. Taoiseach.
The reason why we didn't oppose your party's bill, Deputy, is because, as is often the custom in the House, is if we are broadly supportive of the general approach and the policy principles, we don't seek to divide the House unnecessarily. But as I said before, I don't believe that primary legislation should be used to change the school curriculum. I don't believe that politicians should legislate in the House to determine a school curriculum. It's best done through the NCCA, as it has been done in the past very successfully. So what we're doing is reforming and modernising the relationship and sexuality education curriculum. It'll be a new modern curriculum covering areas that I mentioned earlier, like consent, like LGBTQ issues, like contraception. And we will expect every school in the country to deliver that curriculum, just as they do for other subjects, regardless of the ethos of that school. And schools that want to do other forms of education, such as religious education or faith formation, should do that during a different time of the day.
Thank you, Taoiseach. That concludes Leaders' Questions.